Good afternoon, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma.
Yes, how are you?
Nyaphila kunjani?
Hi, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
As I said before, my name is Sfiso Mtsweni. I'm the executive chairperson of the National Youth Development Agency.
Yes.
And as you know, Ma, that we're celebrating, in fact, we're concluding the Youth Month in the country. And we've been talking to a lot of stakeholders and role players about the significance of this month in particular, but also the role that young people need to play in shaping how society is. And today we thought also we must zoom in on the role that young people ought to play in the African continent. And as Umama was the chairperson of the AU Commission, we thought also we must tap into that experience of yours and share some ideas with you. Starting with the Agenda 2063 that you spearheaded. Now, it's a futuristic program, which we as young people would want to know. Where are we in the picture there? Of course, we are the one who will inherit it in 2063. Now, we want to know what role can we play, what role have young people played in the continent, and how do we assist in ensuring that we meet its objectives?
Youth Month is a very important month in South Africa, but also in the continent. And looking at the present and the future on the continent, the youth have a lot to do. If you look at Agenda 2063, it's not only futuristic, but it's also present. Yeah. It's current. Yeah. That's why it's broken into the first 10-year plan. And the first 10-year plan is based on the aspirations that we found that people in consultation came up with. Yeah. And from those aspirations, then we worked with the people again to come up with a framework, and then from there with a 10-year plan. It seeks to create a prosperous Africa, integrated, peaceful, driven by its citizens, and playing a dynamic role in the global arena. So we had to then say, together with the stakeholders, how do we build this Africa? And the conclusion was, well, let's first see what we have and how we can use what we have to bring this prosperity to Africa, integration and peace. And so the most precious thing that Africa has is its people. We are a very special continent because our population is still growing, but it's also majority young people and women. And so if that's our most precious resource, how do we make use of that resource to actually bring the Africa we want? So we came up with the view that our greatest investment should be in our young people. Investing in their health, but also investing in their education and skills. That's why we came up with that Africa needs a skills revolution, because we need all the skills, the high-level skills in all sectors, but also the technical skills, vocational, artisans, and also create innovators, not job seekers. First, before we can say what role young people should play, what investments do we make into young people? And of course, their role is to learn, is to get those skills. Once they've got those skills, we said, okay, what's the next precious thing we have? The next precious thing we have is our continent, the land. water, forests. And we found that the world has almost exhausted its land for agriculture. If you take the land that's still available in the world for agriculture, that is unused, 60% of it is on our continent. So we must invest in the land, make sure that we irrigate, we modernize agriculture so that we can attract these young people to drive agriculture and see agriculture not only as a chore that old women do in the village, but see it as a business that they can live on, that they can be prosperous from. Africa, unfortunately, still imports about 87% of processed food that we consume, spending billions of dollars instead of processing it here. So we are saying we must do agro-processing. We also need to modernize our continent, but we also need to industrialize. Agriculture is one aspect, but we also have lots of minerals. In Africa, you don't count the minerals you have, you count the ones you don't have, because we have almost everything. But what do? We take it raw, we send it to other countries, to other continents, forgetting that if you send anything raw, you are exporting jobs that would have processed or added value or beneficiated that raw material. You are also exporting revenue because you get very little for raw material, but you get a lot for finished goods. Having industrialized, how do we integrate the continent? We must integrate the continent through infrastructure, road, rail, air, and sea. So we need to build all those, including high-speed rail, and young people must play a role there. We then can trade amongst ourselves. We are a huge continent, over 1 billion people, so we're a big market. Other people see us as a market, but we don't see ourselves as a market for ourselves. So we must trade amongst ourselves. We are trading at average 13% intracontinental trade. So it has to go up. Most continents trade at 50, 60%. So that's why we launched the Intercontinental Africa Free Trade, which hopefully once it's there, it will create a free trade area in Africa. And so we can trade easily, but also increase our global trade. In all those things, young people must be there. They are the majority, they must be skilled, they are the most energetic, creative. So there must be in all these things. In government, we need strong, effective developmental state. And young people must also be part of that state. Respect for human rights, democracy, elections, participatory democracy. Young people must participate. We must silence the guns on the continent. It's not right that we still want to solve our conflicts through the barrel of the gun. We must now learn to negotiate, to discuss if we have problems within the country, because most of the problems now are not between countries, but they are within countries. Young people, women must participate and be the drivers of this agenda. So that's what we think. We also think that the continent has neglected the ocean. That's why we have said this is the decade of the African oceans and seas, because we want to recapture the ocean as a terrain for economic growth, for prosperity. 90% of our goods are transported, that we export or import, are transported through the maritime highways, if you like. But very few of our countries have got fleets that transport. These ships are owned by other people. People who work in those ships are not us. Consumables in those ships are not ours. The insurance that insures the cargo and the ships are not ours. We are not in charge of the logistics that takes those goods from the ports to their destination or from their origin to the ports. So tourism, Africa is the most beautiful continent. It has everything. And it can create a lot of value from tourism, create a lot of jobs from tourism, both coastal tourism, inland tourism, and also floating tourism, these huge cruise ships. So on the continent, and South Africa is no exception, it must do the same. So that's what we think, that the youth today doesn't just have a role, they should be the drivers.
No, thanks, ma'am. I think it's quite exciting what we've heard, but I just want to limit myself, obviously, to just 2 or 3 issues that you have raised. One of them being the issue of skills and education in the continent. I think of late there has been a lot of issues around issues of accessibility, particularly young people on higher education, skills development. And I think one of the big issues that we have faced as the youth is the barrier to access, particularly on the skills that you speak about, that the continent needs, the sciences. Now, I think also infrastructure is another issue, which is quite big, and we need engineers, we need all sorts of young people in that space. But now there's been this issue of the commodification of education, particularly between secondary and higher education. Young people, particularly in our country, have been on the streets calling for the provision of free education, and I know in the continent it's also an issue that is part. So I would have wanted to also hear, Mama, in terms of how then do we approach that particular issue. But the second aspect also, the issue around issues of conflict areas. We know that in many cases where conflict arises in some countries, it's young people that are recruited to become soldiers. In some cases we speak about child soldiers. In some cases even young women, young girls that get even abused in these camps. So I think also as an agency we have an interest in terms of how do we intervene in that space to ensure that we engage with those young people, to ensure that your dream of the guns actually going down, that the youth become the center. So I would have wanted at least to have an engagement around those issues. And of course, as a last point as well, Mom, there's a big issue of youth unemployment, poverty in the continent. and largely again is that we can have all these nice dreams, and there still continues to be a lot of barriers, particularly for young people to enter, especially in the mainstream economy. There's a lot of issues around even young people that have got qualifications, graduates that cannot get jobs because they are told you must have experience, you must have this and that. So as much as the doctor is saying young people need to play a role, but there continues to be barriers and barriers and barriers. And we would have wanted to hear from you in terms of how then do we break down those barriers and ensure that really young people do play that role and they are not just on the outside.
First, I think in terms of education itself, obviously we need to increase the number of teachers, particularly teachers in those areas that are needed more by the economy and who are not producing. Because if we don't produce teachers, we are not going to be able to get students from basic education to higher education. That's one area that we need to look at. But also as a continent, we've been looking at how to harmonize education. The second part, of course, is the infrastructure. It's going to take us a very long time to build enough infrastructure for the number of students that need education. But it's important because during this day and age, there is technology. So I think it's possible to leapfrog the infrastructure. Whilst we are building it, it's slow, but we can use technology. There is nothing that says a lecturer here cannot be lecturing in this lecture hall, but be listened to by many people across the country who are not even in that city. So I think it's very important for us to make sure there is broadband, there is Wi-Fi, so that we can then use technology to expand the space. The third thing that we must obviously look at is what you talked about in terms of, is education a commodity that has to be sold to the highest bidder? No, it's not. Therefore, we must make sure that no child is denied of education because of financial problems or poverty. No. I think for me, that's the bottom line. No child should be denied of education. And I think that goes for the continent as well as it should go for South Africa. Of course, we also need to work with industry because some of the courses need practicals. So we need commitment also from industry to be able to give them practical experience. But also, in terms of employment, this is a big issue, not only in South Africa, but across the continent. And I think it would be maybe a first step to see how do we facilitate at the entry level. Because it's true, if you are young, you come out of university, you apply. They say you need experience. Where do you get it? Because you don't get it from tertiary institutions. There are areas where we can bring in young people to gain experience within the job. Our education should not only look at job seekers. We must also train young people and change their attitude to also want to be job creators, to be entrepreneurs. And I think the state can play an important role together with, obviously, National Youth Development Agency. Because a developmental state, by definition, means it makes certain interventions. And the state in South Africa has a big budget and it buys services. So we can look at how do we maybe have a quota when we buy services as a state to say X amount, 30%, I'm just making an example, would be procured from young people and from women. So, because if you are a young business and you have a guaranteed market, then you can grow and eventually you can branch out to find your market in the private sector as well as elsewhere. So I think the role of the state is going to be very important in terms of procuring services and therefore assisting the formation and growth of businesses by young people and by women. So that's something that we have to look at seriously. Some countries have started doing that. I know Kenya has a quota for government procurement for young people and for women. In terms of conflicts, you are right that it's not old people who carry guns, it's young people, sometimes even children. We must look at this, that if you have a stake in the future of your country and you have a possibility of studying, of getting a job, of creating a job, very few will want to opt to go and carry a gun. They carry guns because they get promised €1 a week or whatever, and because they have nothing. They are not doing anything. They have no possibility. Then they say, okay. So I think it's very important that we see that you cannot have peace and stability and sustain it if you don't have development and prosperity for your people. But as young people, you need to work with other young people, encouraging them to be at school, but also where you can create jobs, encouraging them to getting jobs, and also making them feel that they are important in the country. Because if they feel, well, nobody cares, who cares? So I'll take a gun. And so I think we need to work at different levels, looking at employment, looking at schooling, looking at just giving them self-esteem and confidence and dignity and knowing that my country needs me. Here, we don't have conflicts to silence the guns, but we see abuse of young women, killing of young women, abuse of women. I think young people, not only young girls or young women, it must be everybody. Young men must see it as their responsibility to stop this. So the role is very big. And I think that's what we should also be doing. Researching why this is happening, but making sure that we also have a big campaign to stop it. And if young people stood up and said, this is enough, we don't want it, it would stop. The social ills, drugs that start with smoking, and then from smoking, they graduate to the next. We must all be also campaigning against that, because sometimes it's the drugs that lead to all these other things, killings and so on, when people are high on drugs. And also alcohol. Young people need to also be at the forefront of fighting these social ills. So the guns are the extreme, but there is a whole spectrum of problems that young people can be involved in to create a free and healthier and pleasant place to live in. We can't say we're free if we're not free to walk anytime, anywhere, you know. And so mobilization of young people is very important. And not only mobilize according to political party, but mobilize youth in general. And once youth are mobilized, they can be also very creative, even in terms of jobs and other things. So, but if they are not mobilized, it's going to be very difficult.
No, what led Doctor, that at least you agree. We know, at least we can be comfortable that you are not antagonistic to it. Because when you follow dialectics, sometimes when we read they will tell you about the concept of the old refusing to die and the new not being born. But at least we know in your own view of the country, there is that space for young people. And of course, Mama, this is not just our meeting, maybe from your side, if there are issues that you may want to raise to young people.
Yes, I think we should continue this conversation with young people and other people. So maybe in the next session, I can ask you a number of things, because I want you to also define your role, because it's important also both for the young people to know what old people think, but for old people to know what young people think, because we can't think for you. You must also tell us what you are thinking and define your role, because you're not going to inherit a future. In my view, you must shape that future, and you must shape it today, that you are going to inherit tomorrow. Because if the young people had not shaped the future, we wouldn't be sitting here as free South Africans. We'll still be under apartheid.
No, definitely not, ma'am. We thank you very much. We've taken that decision that we need to engage as many stakeholders as possible. And I think the leadership of the country, of the continent, must also get to know our own views. And I'm glad that you've opened that gate for us. And definitely we'll be coming, we'll be knocking every now and then.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.